Hello, and welcome back to what is not the Western Front, but the logistics office. Today we're going to go through the Soviet anti-tank weapons. Not all anti-tank guns, but we're including a anti-tank rifle and some tank destroyers in this list. And we're going to be doing the traditional tier list format that I'm sure everyone's seen a gazillion times, but apparently my wife hasn't, so who knows? It might be new to you as well. Yeah, I've already sorted and filtered this list, but if you wanted to do this for yourself, all you have to do is go to the commander's report, click on the equipment tab, so equipment, and then make sure ground is selected. And so I pulled out all of the anti-tank guns by filtering it on type. And what it boils down to is these 13 items. This is for the entire war. We have 13 different anti-tank weapons here. And the first guy we're going to be looking at is the ubiquitous in 1941 45 millimeter model 1937 AT gun. We've got a ton of these on the front line. And this puppy is essentially just a very early anti-tank gun. You can see here it's in the picture. I know it's probably really small, but it's got very little armor, no real crew protection to speak of. You can see here its stats for front armor, side armor, top armor are all 0. So if you get shot at when you're shooting one of these bad boys, which you might, I mean, you're shooting at a tank, they might shoot back. God forbid they shoot back because you've got no protection. And that is the biggest weakness of this gun. The gun itself is about standard for this period of anti-tank weapons. It's a little bit underpowered and the barrel length is a little low. This L46 means that it's a length of 46. So the stats that really matter for us are accuracy versus manpower and versus armor. And this one has decent versus armor. As you can see, it's got a high penetration stat. But the problem is it's relatively weak versus manpower, only anti-soft of 38. And you do want a little bit more balance than that. So this is very much a pure anti-tank weapon. And that's what this list is mostly composed of. Stuff that really trades off its anti-soft, which is the majority of units, even in a tank division. The majority of a tank division is not tanks. It's actually infantry, motorized or otherwise. But a tank division is composed of tanks and infantry. So you want to be good against both if you're going up against the tank army. But we do need these things just to knock out tanks. And so this thing definitely can knock out a tank. If you uncheck the same class checkbox, you can compare it against other vehicles that you might face. So a very common one that we face on the front line are these Panzer 38s. And against this thing, we're actually pretty good because it's only got a front armor of 48 millimeters, and we can easily penetrate that. Even their crappiest tank still outguns us in a lot of scenarios because it has higher accuracy, and accuracy is super important early on. So I think that puts it solidly into C tier. It gets or maybe even B. Let's put it in B tier to start out. Just because it gets the job done early on, and we do have enough of them that we can at least, hold the line. Okay, so the next tank, or the next anti-tank gun that we're going to look at is the one right below it, another 45 millimeter, but this is the upgraded version of it, basically, that we get in 1942. So we'll also stick that in B tier. It's essentially the same gun, just slightly upgraded. So against this is basically the same gun. You see it only gives you 10 extra on each stat, essentially. So it's not that good. And it still doesn't really have any protection for the crew. which is a big problem. So we'll put that into the B tier as well. Just because they're essentially the same gun and they're very serviceable. You know what? Actually, for what it is in 1942, it's more of a C tier gun, to be honest. But I think it deserves to be in B tier just because of its, cheapness and reliability in terms of it can get the job done when it's properly employed. Ziz 2, and it's a 73 centimeter gun barrel length. So a lot longer barrel against manpower and armor. It's all around just better. And we do get a lot of these 57 millimeters as 2s. By the time we're in 1943, though, we're facing against some pretty beefy tanks. You're facing like Panzer IV Aus Fs, which have 51 millimeters of armor on the front. And you're facing a lot of Stugs in terms of like close support guns, or assault guns, they call them. This gun can outclass a Panzer IV Aus F. But what it can't outclass is when the Panthers start rolling in. At that point, we would have some of these on the front line already, and you could see the Panther outclasses it in every way, shape, and form. It can't penetrate its front armor, so it has to shoot its side armor. And the Panther's weaponry is incredible. It just is basically unbeatable by our anti-tank gun, our main anti-tank gun in 1943. So that's scary. Luckily, there's not too many of these built. If there were, we would be totally screwed. So this one, I gotta say, for what it's facing at the time, it is a little bit underpowered. So I don't think we can really put this any higher than C tier, as much as it hurts, because I do like the gun. It's just, it's kind of over-reliable, but it's good against the older tanks, not good against the 1943 production tanks like the Panther. Which, unfortunately, that's kind of what we need our anti-tank guns for, because a lot of our older equipment will be fine against the old tanks. We want the new equipment to be good against the new tanks. Possibly the best, or the most widely built anyways, of the anti-tank guns is the Ziz 3. And this started production in 1942. This is essentially the same gun that is mounted on the T-34-76. Its accuracy is actually, it's better than the 45 millimeter ones, but it's still not great. But what it does have is it's much better against infantry than its predecessors. So when this hits the field, it's really good for us. And I cannot wait until we get some of these. I would put this in A tier purely because of its good all-around stats and its just, incredibly wide use. So we'll shrink that down, and this will be our first one in A tier. This is the M27 76.2 millimeter gun. And this is barely an anti-tank gun. I included it in this category, but you can argue that it's more of just a general use field gun. However, historically it was used somewhat in an anti-tank role because of the shortage of anti-tank guns more than anything. Extremely short barrel, so you have to use it in at close range or indirectly. But it can do the job. It has enough penetration to penetrate the light tanks. The problem with this thing, terrible accuracy. It is okay against manpower, but its rate of fire and accuracy really mean that it's essentially useless. So this one, unfortunately, the only place for it is down here. And the other unfortunate thing is we have a ton of these. Not good. Any way you slice it, I don't like it. It's super out of date. It's an older gun. started production in 1939, so probably designed in the early 30s. And it even says model 1927, so it's out of date by the time Barbarossa rolls around. The only reason we need it is because we don't have guns. Now we get to one of the interesting guns that we do have some access to, but not in huge numbers. What it is a slower rate of fire, but better accuracy and better damage overall. Just a bit of a bigger punch. And this thing is actually really good for the year because the rate of fire at this point doesn't matter as much. At best, we're getting like one or two tanks knocked out per battle. And if we had one of these, that might double that number to 2 to 4 tanks per battle. But eventually they do get phased out in 1942. And the reason for that is they're expensive to produce, and they really don't do anything better than the 45 millimeter guns. And they're well more than twice the cost. So unfortunately that means that this one is in D tier, not necessarily because of its combat value, but because of its production rate and values. So that's where that one has to go. So we've got a pretty full list here already, and we haven't even gotten to the interesting guns. So next we have the 14.5 millimeter PTRD anti-tank rifle. And this really is a beautiful weapon because in 1941, when this starts hitting the lines in December, this can really help turn around the war for us. It's got 400 accuracy, and it can penetrate most of their light tanks, especially the side armor. And this thing became the bane of the existence of the German tank arm. They did so many things. In fact, Hitler himself had to order extra armor to be strapped onto the sides of tanks, to be welded on or improvised on. And that became doctrine in 1942 because of the effectiveness of this rifle. Probably most famous for its use during the Battle of Stalingrad, because it was an absolute tank killer in that battle. So I'm really excited to get this on the field. We don't have any of them yet. Put this in the hands of our infantry divisions, which is great. And that's really one of the things we need. Our infantry divisions cannot stand up to tanks at this point in the war. And for that reason alone, it has to go into A tier, because this is in infantry divisions. The other things are not necessarily in infantry divisions. They have to be attached. So the thing to realize about the Su-76 is that when it comes into production, it is obsolete, massively obsolete. But it does a role that nothing else in the Army does at that point. And that's to purely be an ambush weapon. But it really is insufficient for the task that it has. And for that reason alone, I've got to put it in D tier. I mean, it was not very effective in this role. What it is essentially is a mounted version of the Ziz 3. So you stick basically a cut down Ziz 3 onto it. I think the barrel length was like a foot shorter, something along those lines. This is a 42.6. I think the other one is like a 70, 72 or something like that. Less penetration. This only has 94. And it's not as good against armor as you would love it to be. It is less accurate because of the shorter barrel. But because it's mounted and your crew does have protection, it is superior in some ways. But in the same role, you can get a much cheaper. So this costs them $112 to build, and what is essentially the same exact gun costs $26. So you can get 4 of these for Su-76. And for that reason alone, I would say the Su-76 can be no better than C tier. This thing, the Ziz 30, is a very interesting gun, and I don't actually know anything about this. So we're going to have to go completely based on the stats of this gun. The thing is incredible. 1,000% accuracy. It's really good against manpower and incredible against armor. So just looking at the stats here, it's so good. I mean, it's pretty cheap to build, only 82. 1941 weapon. It's only built for a month, but yeah, maybe they should have built a few more of these puppies. It's not too bad. Honestly, for what it is, if it weren't for the short run of production, I would have to call it an A tier, but because it's such a short run of production, I think it's got to go down in the D tier. Again, on production grounds alone, not necessarily that it is a worse gun. I would just say it's not produced widely enough. Then we have the Su-76M, and this one is produced for much longer. It's less outdated, but still suffers the same armor problems. But at least you can bounce a, 7.62 reliably. Yeah, it doesn't have top armor, but the way it was used is as an ambush weapon. So those are the trade-offs for cost, and it actually costs less to build than the other Su-76. This one justifies in B tier. Overall, this is just a pretty good gun. It does have heat rounds too, which is kind of cool. We get to the Su-57, only built starting in 1943 for about a year, and this is essentially a gun on a truck with a little bit of armor. And for the time, not very good stats. The similar weapons at the time have 1,000 accuracy. Gotta say, this one to me is a D tier, maybe even F. Plus, it just looks stupid. For looks alone, I think we gotta go F tier. This gets a big old F. For appearance alone, it's ugly. The Su-85 and the Su-85M are built in pretty large numbers, and this is essentially the answer to the Stug. A pretty high velocity gun, really good penetration, very good accuracy, and just a generally good weapon. Pretty low rate of fire, but I would kill for about 5,000 of these right now. So for me, this one's actually an A tier. Just how useful it is when it hits the field. Because this is one of the few guns that can actually go toe-to-toe with German tanks and successfully kill them. You see here, it actually has armor. 77 millimeters of front armor, 48 side armor, 20 top armor. So reliable gun. Expensive to build, but actually effective. And then the upgraded version is pretty similar. You see it gets more armor, and then we're going to finish it out with the Su-152. And tank destroyers are often hard to classify, but this thing has really good frontal armor, really good side armor, just really good all-around armor, and it's incredible against both armor and manpower, but it is less accurate. Maybe like a C tier for this, because these are very expensive to build. And then the Su-122. So this is a 122 millimeter howitzer. Not particularly great against armor and not great accuracy, but it does a lot of damage. And what this turns into is the Is-152, which is great against everything, but relatively low accuracy and low rate of fire. So it doesn't actually output that much damage. So I would actually put this kind of in the D tier region as well. This is crazy expensive. It doesn't get knocked out easily, but for what it is and what it's giving us, I'd rather have 500 Su-85s or 500 T-34-76s than one of those. And so out of this list, notice we don't have any S tier. And that's intentional. In my opinion, Soviet anti-tank weapons kind of get the thumbs down compared to their German counterparts. The best we have is the ZIS-3, the PTRS, the Su-85. When they go higher than 85, it turns into a slow, useless, inaccurate behemoth. And lower than that, they don't put enough armor on the bloody thing, so it just gets penetrated by anything. So the Su-85 is the best of the crop, but even that is not great compared to what the Germans have available to them, which is the Stug. The Stug outclasses all of these in every year. And it supposedly knocked out tens of thousands of tanks, which I definitely believe. Production-wise, if we have any control, we're going to focus on getting these three, the A tier, into our divisions if we can. So I hope you found that somewhat interesting. I plan to do more of these kind of tier listy ranking videos, and there's not a lot of them. I don't think there's any of them actually on YouTube for this game, but they're very common in other games. So hopefully you enjoy it. And we'll see you back on the Western Front of the Great Patriotic War next time.